Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Midwest Newsroom's audio feature reporting training. Yesterday, we went over searching for stories, vetting your stories, pitching, and preparing to go out to report a little bit. So if you missed that session or you want to go back and rewatch it,
absolutely.
we have recorded it.
Probably a week ago today. Yeah.
And that'll be on YouTube. So we'll send that out either today or later this week. And this one will be recorded as well, so you can watch this and share it with anyone who missed it. Today, we're going to be talking about preparing to report, going out and reporting, and what you do when you get back to your desk, the editing process through filing the story. I am joined with my co-instructor. I said co-host yesterday, but instructor, co-host Maria Altman, who is the editor of Harvest Public Media. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for having me again. And I am going to introduce Grant Gerlock. He is a reporter with Iowa Public Radio. He covers Des Moines and Central Iowa and has been with the station for 3 years. Prior to that, he was with Harvest Public Media and Nebraska Public Media for several years in Nebraska. So thanks, Grant, for joining us. And I'm just going to hop in. If you want to share the slide, Chris, we can kind of get going here and talk about what you should do or what you think about before you kind of hit the road and start doing your interviews. One of the things that it's not for every story, but one thing that I think is a good idea to think about is whether your story is going to have an unusual structure. You might decide to do something a little different with a piece, and so thinking that through even before you get started on your interviews is always a good idea. For instance, maybe you want to try for a non-narrated piece. If you do that, you're probably going to need to do have all of your sources introduce themselves. So say, hi, I'm Maria Altman. I'm the editor of Harvest Public Media. Getting sources to do that is not always easy. It sometimes takes a little work to get them to feel comfortable doing that. Are you going to do a stand-up where you describe this and kind of create a scene by describing something? Will you need to mic yourself in an interview? Is it going to be a particularly difficult interview where it's important for the listeners to hear you ask a question and maybe there's a big long pause before somebody answers with a one-word answer? Think about those things before you go out. So Grant, I just want to throw it to you, and can you, is that something that you do kind of ahead of time? Do you often think about story structure before you start the reporting, or do you like to get the tape and then kind of think about structure?
Before I go out and do interviews, I will have thought about where I think this person will fit in the story. It might change, but I have an idea of where I think they're going to go. This is the person where I'm going to start the story and have a scene, or this is an expert where, I'm just kind of planning on talking to them in their office, so that's okay. I don't need a lot of active sound with them doing something. So that'll change my expectations. And like you said, if it's something like it's non-narrated, that changes how you ask the questions. It needs to be where they're not even so much answering questions, but they're almost telling you stories about the questions. And so you need to ask things in a different way. And you might want to spend a lot more time with them than if you're just doing sort of a typical sit-down interview. I always write out questions beforehand, even if I just stop on the side of the road 15 minutes before to jot down questions if I haven't done it yet. But I always have questions, and I like to circle a couple questions where I'm going to mic myself, because it's sort of the question of the interview. That's one that I like to record myself. Or if it's a question, I don't know, just that where I think it might get a reaction from them in some way, because those can be helpful when you're writing for a transition or for just to add a little interest to their part of the story. So those are some things I'm thinking about. I'm also thinking about how I want to arrive at the interview before I hit the road. When you're talking to someone on the phone before you go out to meet them in person, I'll kind of gauge how they're feeling me out. And if they're someone who feels pretty outgoing and confident, then that might be a situation where I'm more likely to have all my gear strapped on and ready to go full guns when I step out of the car, because it's sometimes nice to have that interaction at the beginning of the interview, like, hey, they're opening the door, they're greeting you and everything. But if they're less confident or more reluctant to talk just on the phone, then it may take some more time to get them to warm up to you. And one way that I think it can help someone ease into an interview is to put together my kit while I'm there just talking to them, just kind of idle chit chat. Be talking, and I'll put on my recorder, I'll put the microphone together, and I'll put my headphones on, and I'll get my notebook out. And it can just give someone a period to acclimate to the idea that they're about to be interviewed, even though they already knew that, and just kind of get comfortable with having a reporter in the room with them and a microphone in front of them.
Grant, you're often thinking about, obviously, your scenes beforehand. We've all had the experience where a scene just doesn't quite work out the way we think. Do you often have sort of a plan B in mind for your, like, okay, if this scene doesn't come together, well, I can go this route?
Yeah, I might have, sometimes I'll try to do a stand-up even if I don't plan to use it. That can be an option for a plan B. Or I think Shayla mentioned yesterday, just interactions around an interview, like if they're talking to you or other people before or after an interview, can be the kind of thing that just kind of helps draw people into the room where the interview happens. And then, I think this is fairly common, like when I was going to talk to farmers. We talked on the phone earlier, they're hauling hay that day. Well, we're not hauling hay, we ended up doing it last night. Well, darn. What else have you got going on today? And just see what they can do. And some people are more comfortable than others just kind of going along with the radio making process. But if you've talked about it ahead of time and sort of explained why you want to have a scene, then maybe they'll be willing to go along. And I don't think it's necessarily like in the situation where they might be doing some different farm work. It's not like I'm asking them to invent something to do. It's just trying to find something else where I can get some active sound. There was something else I had written down. Oh, another thing that, well, maybe I'm getting a little ahead. This is sort of while we're going out, but I'll mention it anyway. I was talking about it, if someone feels like they might be reluctant to talk, I'll explain why I'm talking to them. And I've probably already talked to them about that on the phone. Just kind of going over again, I think it's great to talk to you about this because XYZ, and sort of explains to them why I think they are a good fit for the story, and that can sort of help them be more ready to talk.
Looking at when you're after maybe a particular sound bite, how do you kind of prepare for that? Maybe asking a question or even playing tape for somebody, like if it's a controversial subject and maybe they're really opposing views, and have you done anything like that where you've played tape for somebody and had them react?
I haven't done that specific thing where I played tape for someone and have them react, but it could also just be where you're stating the opposing viewpoint, right? Where, I think it's a pretty common question for reporters to ask. What do you say to people who believe that, just to use the example you were using yesterday, that carbon credits are a lousy way to address climate change through agriculture. Or also sometimes I'll just sort of present the thesis of the story and get their reaction to that. So I haven't done it specifically by playing tape back to them, but I think there are other examples of where you can just lay something out for someone to get their reaction to it.
I'd also like to bring up pre-interviewing. I have to say, as a reporter, I was not a huge fan of it because I always found I had a really hard time getting people to have the same great sound bites the second time around. So, Grant, do you pre-interview much? And then what are your tips for kind of keeping it fresh and having it not sound like having somebody say, well, like I told you the other day, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think you just don't want to take it too far. So, you want to have your main questions, but you don't want to give away the farm in the pre-interview. I want to pre-interview enough, obviously, to know that they'll be a good person to talk to and that they know what they're talking about and they might have a good story. I also I want the pre-interview to be more of a, this makes it sound like I want the interview to be more formal, but it's sort of got a little less direction to it. I'm as much trying to get a feel for the person as I am to get specific information. So that's sort of what I'm keeping in mind when I'm doing the pre-interview. Yeah, those are just some basics that I would mention.
Yeah. And Chris, jump in. What are things that you as a reporter and as an editor kind of do before you go out on an interview? What are the things that you sort of prep?
I was going to say, I try to do as much as I can ahead of time. I do have my questions written out, but I leave flexibility in there. I have specific questions to target the answers I know I need to get from the source. There'll be maybe 2 or 3 softball questions up at the top just to get them comfortable with me, building that trust. We'll talk about that in a second. And then just making sure that I have that answer clearly stated for my audio story once I start pulling the sound bites or the clips from it. I want to say we do have Frank Morris who has joined us, and I'd love to get some of his thoughts. All right, actually, Maria, do you want to introduce the legendary Frank Morris first?
Absolutely. So Frank has been with KCUR for about 30 years, and he splits his time doing national stories for NPR and local stuff for KCUR. And I'll throw it to you, Frank. What are some of the things that we talked a little bit about thinking about structure before you go out and do interviews? And I'm curious if you think about story structure much before you do interviews. And then, just what you kind of do to prep and plan before you go out on interviews.
Grant, I thought answered those questions pretty well. But one thing that I try to do, and I kind of struggle every time to do this because it's hard, is to have a working outline, not just when I leave to have kind of an idea of, how the story might go, but then to kind of have that in my mind while I'm talking to people, like, uh-oh, that just went to the top, and this, so, because that again sort of informs so if that person's at the top now, then how am I going to get from, Plainville to Hooperville, or what's, so, how is that going to work? Again, that's almost aspirational, because sometimes I can do it and sometimes I can't. I just don't have the bandwidth to do that. But optimally, that's a really good way to save a ton of time and have the stories just click together when you get back to write it. So that would be the only thing I think I'd add.
Yeah. Do you think about sound for transitions. So as you said, getting from Plainview to Hooperville, do you have some cheats that you use, like having your recorder on when you walk in the door, getting a little sound in the car as you drive into a place? Do you have some kind of, you don't want them to become cliches, but just some easy things that you do?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. I was told long ago, and I'm, as you mentioned, I've been doing this a long time. I started out with cassette tapes, so there you were kind of limited on how much time you had. Also, so yeah, just I will put the kit together in the car next to me, so that and that does a couple of things. When I get out of the car, I always have that running, so it's running. And you might this is something I've completely done a 180 on. I never wear headphones. So I just get out of the car, I've got my thing on, and it's running, and just like I'm acting like this is just nothing at all that I'm carrying around here. Knock, 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 woof, woof, hi, hey, and that's, again, often just even the door closing, whatever, all that stuff can be golden, especially if you kind of forget to just actually get, that, establishing, shot of audio that you might want to have. But that would be just another thing that I do, that I think is, it can work both ways. Sometimes people are put off by, like, wait a sec, that thing's running, you're recording now. But oftentimes, and then I just go, oh yeah, I mean, it's always going. I mean, I'm a radio reporter, I just report audio, so don't worry about that, but because I obviously people are more interesting when they're just talking than they are when they're trying to formulate a quote. So that's another thing that I do.
Well, I think that's a really good transition, Chris, to the next slide, and I'll let you take it on the interviews.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say about this is we always tell you bring extra batteries and SD cards. You don't want to run out of that. And then make sure you double check. I learned this as a harvest reporter, especially when you're going to rural areas. Double check with the source about where you're going, because Google Maps is not your friend when you're in rural Missouri or rural wherever. Okay, so while you're out reporting, there's a few things that you kind of do when you get to the scene, which we've already covered a little bit about. When you get there, assess the scene, look around to see what possible distractions, audio distractions could be there. Maybe you're going to an office and there's a giant air conditioner right there. That's not the greatest place to do your interview. There's the hum of the neon lights above the office that you're doing the interview in. There is traffic going by really loudly. Look for those things so you can kind of figure out where your interview is going to be, but also look for potential scenes. So, if you're showing up to the farm and they are about to feed the cattle and they got their buckets of feed, go get the microphone and go get that real quick. So kind of assess the scene, look for distractions, but also look for opportunities to get some good nat sounds. This is something that it's good to try to do, but also all of these are not hard rules. These are flexible rules, but try to set yourself a time limit so you don't spend 2.5 hours doing an interview, because that's just awful to go through all that tape, especially when you have your story that you need to get. Hence, we tell you to plan ahead with your questions so you're going to get what you need to get. And then you have a couple, 20 more minutes to see if there's anything else you can fish around. But you want to try to make sure that you're getting what you need to get for your audio feature. So by setting, like, say, for my interviews, I try to set it 45 minutes tops, but then I leave, 30 minutes to maybe take a tour of the house or take hop in the truck and take me to where the greenhouse is, whatever it might be. But I also give myself a buffer, another 15-20 minutes, because sometimes interviews are just too good and you want to keep them going and you're getting really good stuff. So you have that space to do that as well. But setting yourself a time limit kind of helps you stay on track of what you need to do instead of just spending 3 hours at someone's in an interview. You'll get people who are really hard to interview, and you're trying to pull stuff out of them, and it makes you work extra hard. And then you get the people that just won't stop talking, and you really need to kind of steer them back toward what you need to get. So working with the time limit at least helps set a parameter for you to accomplish what your goal is there. We talked a little bit about tips and tricks on building trust with your source. Ideally, you've already done a bit of that with pre-interviewing or setting up the interview. There's more work to be done once you get there. And I was going to ask, let's start with Frank first, and then I'll go to Grant. How do you try to establish trust with a source that may be a little wary of giving an honest, candid interview about whatever the topic might be?
Well, I think the main thing I try to do is, as much as possible, let them know that I kind of know what I'm talking about, and that I know where, or have an idea where they're coming from. You know, I'm from a small town originally. I pull that out of my back pocket all the time. Oh, well, I'm from a little town. And so, but mainly that's just sort of a springboard into, and so I kind of understand what these dynamics are like. I'm not out to get you. I'm not out to, you know, and I mean, I tell them, look, I want to do interesting stories. I'm not here to be to promote an idea, and I know that, you know, the ideas that I come into this aren't necessarily right. So I just do a lot of that kind of talking with them. But I think the main thing is just from the get-go, let them know, like, yeah, I pretty much know what I'm talking about here. You're not going to have to, you know, or if I am super dumb about a topic, I'll just tell them, like, you know, I'm sorry, I'm an idiot. I have no idea what I'm talking about here. You're going to have to help me. But just like, so it's transparent.
Another thing on being transparent is I'll tell them how I'm going to use the interview, like how this process is going to go. I'm going to take this interview. I'm going to go back. I've talked to these other people. I'm going to be we're going to talk for 20 minutes, and I'm probably going to end up taking 2 or 3, 10, 15 second sound bites out of that to include in this story. Just to, I don't know, again, it's just another way to be transparent about what the process is like and where they fit into it.
One tiny thing I would add on that, I do exactly the same thing that Grant's talking about. And sometimes I'll even tell them, if we got the outline, I'll tell them, well, so you're going to be kind of in the middle of the story, right after this guy, and you know, here's why I want to talk with you to, you know, if they want to know that. They don't want to, you know, that's not lead with that. If they're, you know, pulling, you know, asking me, well, if they're unsure, you know, then I'll just tell them where I think they go in the story.
So what I'm hearing, and it's some tactics I use too, is make yourself relatable, so they can connect with you, because you can find something that you share in common, most likely, and that helps establish some trust. And then be clear and transparent about your intentions for their interview and what the plan is for that, and that helps put people at ease that they're not getting tricked, because a lot of people think that might be happening. No, that's good advice. Maria, you've done this too. So what are your kind of tips and tricks for establishing some trust with sources and making sure that they kind of fill that voice or that perspective that you need for a story?
Yeah, I mean, I just echo what everyone has said. I mean, I don't walk in the door immediately trying to ask the hard question. It's definitely warming them up. As Grant talked about, coming in, putting your equipment together. Sometimes if you are not recording from the get-go, chatting with them about just whatever's happening in that neck of the woods. Yeah, and then kind of easing into the interview, usually letting them kind of give their, people usually like to talk about what they do, and, you know, and so that it's not too tricky. And typically I find if it is a more difficult interview, it's usually people who are used to being interviewed. And I would say that if you're interviewing somebody who has never dealt with a journalist, then I'm much more walking them through the process than someone who's a public official. I mean, and I'm going to give them a lot more leeway too than somebody who's used to dealing with reporters. But yeah, I mean, I don't have anything much more that I have done.
Jeremy in the chat said, I find people really appreciate being told that in the context of this 20-minute interview, they're perfectly free to stop and restart their thoughts, say, that's not a great example, and come up with another one. No one is going to hear every word of this I say every time to them. And that is true. If they stumble and they want to start over, tell them, go ahead, feel free to do that.
Yeah, and I would often tell people, I'm not trying to make you sound bad. I will always make you try, the idea is to get your ideas across, to make it clear what you think. So this is not about taking your, ums and ahs and putting them out there to the world.
So while you're doing your interview, one of the tips that we often try to encourage reporters to do is ask open-ended questions, so you get the feelings, well, how does that make you feel? And what were you thinking at the time when this was happening? So they can come up with words. They're not just answering, yeah, my farm, we declared bankruptcy 2 years ago. Well, how did that make you feel? And then you get a much better, robust soundbite that can be used in your story that gives some compelling, engaging emotion to connect the listener with the source in your story. I want to ask Grant and Frank, what are some questions that you make sure that you definitely ask every time? There's the targeted questions where you need to get a specific answer, but then there's the other ones where you want to get a really good soundbite. And I'm curious what some of those are for you. Let's start with Grant this time.
One that I'll often include is some version of, what do you think people get wrong about this? People often have an axe to grind about other people's perceptions of them or of their position on an issue. So sometimes I can get a good response.
Yeah, and I would say too, with asking open-ended questions, another advantage of that is it tends to give you complete answers. So you're getting more, because that's what you're fishing for, is answers with a subject, with the whole sentence is there instead of just half a sentence. I always find myself asking, and I kind of hate to hear me say it all the time, but I'll just get to something. What's going on here? What are we looking at? What is this? I used to always ask, where are we? But people, want to, well, we're at 725 Grant Street and, Christmas tree Lane, whatever. And always, when you get, say, interviews kind of winding up, I will just sort of like, put the mic down a little bit and kind of chat. And then I kind of say so what's the bottom line here? And oftentimes, because that's from experience, a lot of people have had this experience, I think, the interview's over, you shut the thing off, and the person says, the real thing is this. And that's that's some awesome soundbite. You turn it, wait a second, what was that again? Well, and then they give you some kind of convoluted, long, version of the same thing. So I was just, what's the bottom line? What do you really need to understand about it? What's the main thing? I always ask some version of that question.
I'm going to keep it moving along here. That's really good. So again, ultimately, while you're out reporting, be nimble. If the story starts unfolding in a way you did not expect it to, chase that down. Go there. See what direction that takes it. It may be your next story, or it may be the way your story pivots that you're reporting. It doesn't happen that often, but be prepared for that to happen. Maybe there's an interaction. Someone shows up at the house while you're doing the interview, and you've got a whole new scene. Be ready to go record that if you can. So being nimble while you're out in the field is important. On the technical end, don't forget to record your ambi because you want that to make sure that your sound bites connect together and seem very cohesive. And then check your tape before you leave. make sure that you're recording, because you may not have the chance to get back to that location, or that may be your one shot at that interview. So make sure you got it before you leave. It feels awful to have to call someone back and say, I'm so sorry, can we do that again? You may have missed your shot on that. So just double check that you were recording. Hopefully you were monitoring the entire time, but just double check. And then ultimately, while you're there, just don't forget that your story's driving question that you are trying to get done on this piece. All right, I'll pass it over to Maria again. Now you've done your reporting, you're back at your desk.
Yeah, so what do you do when you're back in the studio or back home, wherever you're working? I think it's important to get that audio and put it into and save it in a clear way right away, because there's nothing worse than trying to, I know I did that interview a week ago, where is it, you know, scrolling through on your recorder. And so get it saved. Transcribe or not to transcribe, I'd really to hear what people think of that. I got out of reporting and into editing right when Otter and a lot of transcription services were becoming big. So transcribing for me was sitting and listening and typing, and I got really fast at it. But man, it still took a lot of time. And I didn't do it for every interview. I did it for the most important interviews where I felt like I really needed to know really the whole, everything that they had to say, and needed to see it in writing. Again, in thinking about the structure of your story, and before you sit down and actually write the script, maybe it's a quick outline. I always like to do that, but I'm going to ask, I'll start with Frank. I think we started with Grant last time. What do you do when you first get back? What are your first things to do?
Well, absolutely. First thing to do is transfer the audio. And then as long as it's not sort of Andy heavy, if it's the kind of the meat of the story, I will put it on Temi. I'll just have it transcribed. But before I get back, I listen to it. I listen to it on the way home. And I find that super, super helpful, especially on sort of a quick turnaround. It's imperative that you listen to the tape on the way home and, kind of know what the sound bites are. And also, it keeps your mind from wandering while you're driving back. It keeps you like on the story. And then, yeah, once I have it in Temi, then I will just go through and highlight some paragraphs, put them on what I call a log, and then I've got sort of manageable building blocks that I can plug into an outline on the other screen. That's basically it.
How about you, Grant? What do you do?
So once I get home and move the audio onto the computer, put it through transcription, and then I will go through that, and usually I'll do marks on my recorder while we're talking, and I'll kind of go through and highlight those sections of the interview that I've marked, or other parts that I know they said something around here, and I'll find that in the transcription and highlight it. And it's great to have that beginning structure that Frank and I talked about, because it helps to not be looking at the death that is just the blank page in front of you. That's like the worst feeling. And so, but if you have, a basic structure just to start with, to have where I think people will go in the story, I can start to move some of those things over. Even if I have 3 sound bites right now put in the place where only one is going to end up, I'll start to move those sound bites that I like, that are saying, that are making the point that I want to make there. I'll move those over and start to fill in those sections with tape. And then I'll start writing around that tape to fill things out. That's how I get started.
Yeah, I would just tag team on that, Grant. Then you have, when you have the sort of those options, you start writing it, and then you realize, oh, this is going to work a lot easier with option B than option A or C, because just like the what has to get done in terms of the writing to get to there or to get out of there. So yeah, I do exactly the same thing, put different options up.
And that's good to have for your editor who may say, hey, do you have another soundbite that works here differently? The number of times that your editor will ask that, it's great to already know what those options are.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. The other thing that I, many years ago heard was thinking about what was the most memorable thing in reporting this story, what really stuck out, and do you think about that? Frank, do you kind of go, oh, wow, that was unexpected? Or, and also, do you think about once you've done the reporting, you've thought about structure, do you think a lot about beginnings and endings when you sit down to write?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's when I'm like looking at my tape, I will often make a little note like, end, just the end, because I'm always looking for the ending. You kind of know what the beginning's going to be. And I'll try to, like I'm always running behind, it seems like when I'm out in the field, because I always underestimate how long it's going to take with people. But I like to get back in the car and just kind of go like, okay, what was that? Yeah, that was weird. Right. Just take a couple of notes, and oftentimes those notes, are can be helpful. And it only takes a second to just kind of like, yeah, that was a weird, pair of pants that guy had on, or whatever.
How about you, Grant? Like when you are, first coming to the page and you've got your audio, or even when you're getting in the car to leave your last interview, are you thinking, where do I start this story? Where do I end this story? And what was the most what was the best audio?
I will admit to being a lot better at beginnings and endings. I oftentimes end up writing everything through and like, oh my God, how am I going to end this? Like last lines are one of the things I hate most about finishing a story. But yeah, some of the things that I'll think about when I reflect on the interviews are, and I'll even go back to sort of the driving question or that main question, like, first of all, hopefully I got that question answered. And is that still the question that I'm after? The same question that I went in with. So just kind of go back over how you're thinking about the story and the things that stood out. And it might be, there might be some details that I'll jot down about that I can write in for a description. I'll also jot those things down so I don't forget it, like a sign that I saw or what they were wearing, or just some other detail that might help bring some vivid description to the story. Those are good to write down because they can be hard to remember after you get back and you've moved your sound over and you're trying to remember what was it that is said on his shirt or something like that.
If I could just,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Frank.
Well, I mean, just in terms of details, another thing that I don't always do it. I wish I did, but just snap some pictures. Not the pictures you're going to use in the story, but just like snap, because that will give you those details. Like, oh, what was that thing on the wall, or whatever. And then you kind of go through those photos, and it sort of like takes you back into the same kind of headspace that you were in your interview.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm curious about how much you're thinking about the length of the piece as you're writing. Are you, do you just kind of like, I'm going to hammer this thing out. I'm going to put in everything that I think works. And then I'm going to go back and kind of prune out, particular sound bites. Or do you really write to time from the get-go? And I'll start with you, Grant.
Yeah, I have to keep time in mind. I may have an idea of about how many sound bites are going to fit in this thing, like maybe 6 sound bites or something. And so I have an idea of, in that outline, I sort of have an idea of, I can spend, a minute in this first scene, and I can spend 45 seconds with my expert, just sort of just some idea to keep myself in check as I'm writing so I don't go way out of whack. Another thing I'll do is, as I start to go through those sections and I'm kind of overwriting, I'll just kind of be constantly going back through and revising, but I won't just delete stuff. I'll throw it at the bottom of the script so that I can go back to those ideas as I write. I may want to, resurrect something, or I just want to check myself. Like, I'll put stuff down there like, I don't want to forget to include this fact in the story. I don't want to forget to, mention this person's title or something like that. Or I might throw down there stuff that I know I need to fact check before I'm totally done with this thing. Things that come up in the interview that I've included in that section now. I need to write myself a reminder at the bottom. Hey, I need to check this out before I go through my edit with Maria. So those are some of the things that I'll be thinking through as I'm starting to refine those sections from their most raw form.
How about you, Frank? Do you really keep a sort of a tight sense of, okay, I'm going to go to, I interviewed 6 people, but I'm only going to use 4, and do you keep it pretty tight with your writing, or do you just let yourself kind of write it and then go back and edit for time?
It really depends on how much I've got my shit together and how intense the deadline pressure is. I did a piece for about a flood in Oklahoma once, and I was supposed to be 3:45, and I brought it in at 3:45, same day turnaround. And Russell's like, well, do you have anything else? I'm like, no, we're done. Aren't we? We're done. I think we're done. But conversely, if I get just kind of in the weeds, like Grant, I'll put it right up at the top of the page. Here are the things I need to include in this story. And then, this is like the miserable version, but I'll just write a 7-minute story, because I can't figure out how to do it. And by doing it, then I'll kind of say, okay, well, this is obviously garbage and this is garbage, and I'll tighten it up afterwards. And normally I'll come in like a minute long, and I know it's going to be a minute long, but I always think this is a 3.5-minute story. I'll tell people all the time too, hey, what I'm doing here is a 3.5-minute story, even though it might be a 4-minute story. This is just a 3.5-minute story. So this isn't going to take, but I was reinforcing it for myself. You don't have time to, yeah, there might be a lot of wonderful things to observe and record here. However, there is a product at the end of that, and that's a 3.5-minute story. So I try to keep that pretty front and center.
Yeah, Chris, and I'll let you jump in and with any thoughts on writing and kind of how to keep it in mind, what the length is. And
yeah, what I would also, what I want to just add in is a soundbite in these stories generally is going to be about 12-15 seconds long. If you have a 30-second soundbite clip in there, that's going to be pretty long for your editor. There has to be a really solid reason to have that long of something in there. So keep that in mind when we're talking about how many soundbites go into a feature. I would also add in that if you bring a story to your editor that is 5.5 minutes long and you've been allotted 3.5 minutes, that's not a fun situation to be in, and you won't even really get an edit. You will be sent away to go trim it down yourself to deliver something to your editor that's maybe 30-45 second tops over your time, and then you can cut it down from there. So don't come with a giant thing. If your story ends up being 2 minutes long, there's probably more things that you're supposed to have in there. So go search for that if you're missing it, which could be the hole in your piece.
Maria,
Yeah.
how much are you willing for reporters to share in the misery of cutting down a story that's like a minute long or something? And they're like, I just, because it can be easy to just become dedicated to the people that you talk to and feel like there's a lot of important information in here. And it just can get hard to keep cutting and cutting and cutting the things you like.
I think I am fine. And I've told, when I was new to editing, there were a few times where I got pieces that were double the length, and I was sort of like, because I was the type of reporter that brought it to time, because I hated, especially with working with Ken Barkas, I really, really, really hated the process of being sent back to change my story in an hour. That drove me crazy. So I learned how to write to the exact time. The downside of that is you can sometimes self-edit too much. And so I am totally good with getting a piece that's 30 seconds too long or even a minute too long. What I tell reporters is, if you're in the writing process and you're really struggling about, do I include this or don't I include this? Let me know, like get in touch with me and we can talk structure as you're writing. Because it is a little too much to get a piece that's 2 minutes, longer, and to try to edit that down under a deadline. But I'm totally fine being involved in that process of who do we include, who do we not include, what, and there have been times where I've had a reporter come to me and say, I don't think I can do this in 4.5 minutes. I think this is an segment. And then we talk through that. And my first question will be, do you have more than one scene? If you don't have more than one scene, you're not getting 7 minutes. But yeah, I understand that you really get attached to particular people. And I think an editor can totally be involved in deciding, helping the reporter sort of figure out, who do I include, who don't I?
That's getting us to the next sections here. So I'm gonna kind of move us along. We're getting a little behind on time. So when you're writing your script, ultimately you are writing for a listener. You're writing for the ear. That's very different than writing your digital version. So think about it as broadcast is a linear process. So as you're experiencing it, you cannot rewind. I mean, if you're listening to something on demand, you can rewind it really quickly, 15 seconds or however on a podcast or on demand audio. But generally, when people are listening on the radio, you have to write in a linear fashion because they cannot go back to the beginning if they lost the train of thought. Keep that in mind. Everyone probably knows this. In general, we want to be conversational in our stories, like we're telling our mother, our friend. You're breaking down complex topics in a simple way. If they want to get more into it, they can go to the digital version, but they're experiencing the story from A to B one time on the radio. So you have to make sure that they're able to digest that information easily. Part of that would be leaving out all the legalese and jargon that often come with the reporting that we do, that we all know by the end of our story very well. You can't include that. One example that I often use is in ag reporting. Sometimes you have to write about the beef checkoff, and people don't know what a checkoff is. So you have to quickly define that, because you can't get around not using that word, because that's what it's called. So if you simply say, oh, the beef checkoff, it's like a tax that every time a head of cattle is sold, $1 goes in a pot of money that gets spent collectively for research and promotion of American beef. One sentence, now we know what checkoff is and we can use that word, but you had to do it really quickly. When you say it's like a tax, then people are like, oh yeah, I know what that is. So if you have to use it, define it quickly and simply, but try to avoid any of those terms for the radio version of the story. All right. Maria, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, just, I think the things you've all heard, keep it, your sentences short. If you have to breathe in the middle of a sentence, because you're going to have to voice this, then it's probably too long. Keep subject, verb, object. It keeps your writing active. Think about really descriptive, active verbs. We keep it in the present tense. Says is better than said, and it's hard, I think, for reporters when you go from radio to web and all of a sudden you go back and forth on that. But yeah, and round out those numbers, make the numbers easy to understand. If you've got a super crazy lengthy title, make it simpler. Yeah, I think that's about it. I had one note for myself and I can't find it, so that's good.
All right. We'll go right to this section, which we were kind of going through. So before you turn your script into your Editor, how do you know that you are ready? So have you read through your script? When you read through it, you know all the pieces. Maybe you're going to move some things around. Are there any glaring holes that you know are missing in this story? Is there an explanation that's missing? Is there some historical context of understanding how this even began? You have to kind of read through that, maybe ask a friend to read through it, or a colleague if you're unsure of it. But generally, you should have an idea if there's a hole in your story and you need to go back and get a voice that was missing, or if there's a soundbite that you really should have gotten, go get that. Have you checked all the names and facts? Are they verified? Are they spelled correctly? Are their titles correct? Is there any math that you did in your story? Did you double check that? Did you have someone else double check that? Are there any statistics that need to be attributed? Is that in there? Did you do it in a quick, swift way so it's not this long attribution? Those are the things that your editor is going to ask when you start going through the line-by-line edits. So double check to make sure that all that is right, so you can automatically say yes when your editor asks you that. Is your audio clear? Did you record in a crystal clear audio format? If something is fuzzy, if there is a noisy distraction in the background, it's not going to air nationally for sure, and it's going to take a lot to fix that with your audio engineer to get it to a place. So again, on the front end, hopefully you recorded well. If you have some audio that you're not sure about, I'm happy as the editor often to just send me a clip of it, let me listen to it, and I'll tell you yes or no. I'm sure most editors are probably like that if they have the time. But making sure your audio is clear enough that people will understand what it is. Sometimes this is often a question if one of the sources has a strong accent. Is it understandable enough for people to hear what's hear the point that the person is trying to make, or do you need to do a little writing on the front and back end of it to make sure that that voice is understood, or do we need to find a different voice that can make that point? Have you read your script out loud? That is one of the easiest things to do that everyone learns early on, and it really is important because you'll see where you stumble in your voicing. You'll see where the lead into a soundbite doesn't really work, or you need to tweak it, and you'll see where you used the same word multiple times, and you need to switch that up because it's far too repetitive. You also realize where you may have already made a point and it's redundant from something that maybe was in the intro, and you're like, oh, that's an easy cut, and you don't have to worry about being over time. So reading it out loud lets you listen and hear these things that you may not pick up when you're just reading through the script. And then finally, ultimately, how long is it? We just talked about this. You don't want to 2 minutes over your piece and turn that into your editor. That's not fun to deal with. If you really want to fight for something, leave it in there, but have a reason why you think that it's worth fighting. The whole process of editing should be a collaboration. It is not your editor telling you to not do things. It is helping you teaming up together to create the best story for the audience to pay attention to and engage with. I want to ask Grant and Frank, when do you know that your script is ready for an edit? Let's start with Frank this time and then go Grant.
Question. Normally when it's 1 o'clock and we're editing at 1 o'clock, that's because I'll keep toying with the script right up until it's time to edit, because I'll just go through and kind of nickel and dime and take stuff out and sharpen it up. But yeah, I mean, I've had the experience of Ken saying the script is not, you're not ready for an edit. And it's a pretty brutal, assessment of your work. So I work pretty hard, like right up until it's time to edit before the edit.
I need to have cleared those questions and other things that I put at the bottom, like all those things that I wanted to include, or those questions that were, or those lines that I thought might fit, but I kind of threw down there. I want to resolve all that and just sort of come to peace with all those different things before I feel like I'm really ready to go over it with my editor. And I read through it a ton, just like over and over and over again. I think that's probably, like Frank was saying, just nickel and diming the intro, that last line that I said I hate to write, The last line is as important as it is, and as much as I don't like it, it's so important because it's the last thing the listener hears, and it really kind of can shape how what they take away from the story. And so it's really important to kind of keep that in mind as you're going through, but just kind of constantly, like, as I'm reading it, where do I trip up? Where do I feel my own mind wandering? And if my mind is wandering while I'm reading it, the same might be happening for a listener.
Yeah, I did a Planet Money training a couple years ago, and they do group edits where when they're playing the audio and reading the script, everyone who's listening makes a note of when their mind drifted away, and that's a point that they'll return to and rework that section. Obviously, those are much more longer form pieces. But it is something to keep in mind. If your mind, as the reporter, is drifting away in the story, maybe you need to rework that section just a little bit. I'm going to keep us moving because we are running short on time here. And thank you for the questions in here. I will make sure we get to those at the end. Okay, Maria, you'll take this. This is kind of open-ended because everyone has a different process of editing. So why don't you talk about it, Maria?
Sure. So the editing process for me is I do ear edits first. So reporters, we just, similar to anybody who has edited with Ken Varkas, wants to, he wants to hear the piece first, do a live read with the bites. I use that to hear the structure. Is it engaging? Is the first bite, like, going to grab me? Is it explained well? Is it clear? Does my mind wander, or do I not understand something the first time I hear it? Those are the things that I'm writing down. From there, if there's a lot of structural changes, we'll typically take care of those. Hey, I think this belongs up, and you could end with that bit. And then the reporter, I'll send them away for however long they say, oh, that'll take me an hour. Okay, great. And we'll come together for a second edit and do another read through. At that point, or maybe even in the first edit, then I'll go through and do a line by line and read it through. That's typically how I like to work. Most of the time, I would say average 2 edits on audio pieces. But they could, 3 edits happens pretty regularly. And if it's an investigative piece, it could be more, and it will probably include another editor. So that's generally how I do it. How about you, Chris?
I like to see a script first, just so I can make sure. I like to visually look at a script to see where the sound bites are and see the spacing. I think it takes a talented editor to do listening edits. So I applaud you, Maria, and Ken's been doing it for years. And I aspire to be able to digest the story that way and be able to edit. I like to visually see the script first, but that gives me a chance to do what would be feedback, which is, all right, this looks good, but you need to restructure, like maybe move this around, go find a soundbite here, and then I'll do a listening edit, and then we'll do the line by line script edit. Is typically how it goes. But again, this is check with the editor you're working with on this and see what their flow is and how they prefer to do edits. I said this yesterday, but I encourage everyone as a reporter to work with as many editors as they can, because you learn a lot of tips and tricks from different editors, and you become a better reporter, and editors become better editors because they get to work with different reporters. So oftentimes NPR will do a call out, one of the shows they do a call out because they're doing a special summer series on something. Pitch something for that, and it could be a fun story, and you'll get to work with a national desk editor on one of the desks, or someone on the arts desk, someone on the science desk, whatever it might be. It's a good experience, and you get to learn how different editors work in the process. So this is kind of vague because everyone's different.
Yeah, and I'll just say a couple more quick things before we get to questions.
Yeah.
One thing that I kind of along the road with editing learned was to ask reporters right away, how do you feel about the piece?
Yes.
Before we even start editing, because I want to hear what the reporter thinks is a trouble area so that I can give special attention to that, or I want, it's so much easier to edit a piece if you kind of know how a reporter feels about it. And do come prepared with some ideas of, oh, I have another bite for that section, or, you don't have to have a completely other script, but I have had reporters who are like, I'm going to try this. This is my crazy piece. And then I've got my little, my backup piece. You don't have to do that unless you really go out on a limb. The other thing I would say, if you ever have a rural story that you think is of more interest than for your local station, pitch me. I'm happy to work with station reporters. I really like to do that. So yeah, keep that in mind. And with that, Chris, I'll let you take it away with questions.
One more page. Yeah, one more slide, and then we got questions. I'll go through this quickly, but I do want to get Grant and Frank's perspective quickly on this. That can roll us right into questions. So after the script's approved, you're probably going to have to do some voicing. Try voicing to tape. That means try playing your sound. If you have the luxury of time, play your soundbite while you're in the studio, and then voice the track right after that as you do in your script, kind of like you did your listening edit. You will hear your tone of voice change when you hear the soundbite you're coming out of, and then you start voicing to it. It kind of puts a cohesive flow and tone to the piece that you may not get if you just voice your script or the narration or the tracking and then edit it all together. Again, luxury of time, we don't always have that, but if you can try to voice the tape, that's what the Kaiser Health team does for a lot of their stories when they have the time for that. If you find yourself sounding sullen and not energetic, depending on the tone of the piece, try standing up and use your hands when you're talking. That can help get your make it a little more peppy of voicing than sounding sullen and low while you're doing the tracking. And then always listen back to the audio. If you think you stumbled when you were voicing, you probably did. So go back and listen to that so you can revoice it while you're in the studio, so you don't have to keep popping back and forth in between. Mixing, a few things here. Most of us make sure you're doing this, but work in multi-track editing. Simple thing people learn early on, if they haven't done it, don't cut out your breaths. That's important to keep in there. Early on, reporters will sometimes try to cut out the breaths because they'll know it saves time, but then you are just barreling through information for the listener. Those pauses give you the cadence of a story where you can actually understand what's happening, because this is how we talk. If you can, ideally you want to have in multi-track, have each your reporter track in one channel, and then each source in their own channel, the nat sounds in another one, and the ambient in another one. The reason it's useful to do that, especially when you're doing more long form or even podcasting type stories, is you're able to isolate the section that may be a problematic part of the audio. So there may be some like click happening, and then you can mute all the other channels except for the one that you think it is, and you can go through and listen to that. So isolating the channels by separating them in your multi-track is helpful and useful. We could do a whole thing on multi-track editing. Maybe that's another course or a training down the line, but that's helpful. Quick fade-ins are really helpful. Those are if you're using Audition, it's the little boxes at the top where you can just drag it and give it a quick fade-in. So you're not fading something in slowly, but this helps when you're just jumping into a scene. Maybe it's loud, maybe you're at the state fair and it's really loud. If you just hard open, that's going to be a lot of noise for the listener to get blasted with. But if you just give it like a half a second, just a quick little fade in, it just sends you right in there. It also helps when you're doing soundbite edits and maybe you're cutting them right at the end, but they kind of slur into another word, but you don't have the space for that word. You can, trim it and then just give it a slight little fade out as well, and that will smooth out that transition, so it's not a abrupt like, wait, they were in the middle of a sentence. So that's a good little tip to use. And then making sure that you know the settings that the station or network that you're filing to, what their settings that they prefer, the bit rate, or if they want it as a wave, or if it's going online and needs to be an MP3, just know what settings you need for the mix down. And then filing, this is going to be different for every station, but make sure you know where you're saving it and who you're sending the final scripts and audio files to. If this is someone you've never filed before and you're not in-house, make sure you have your phone number and your contact information in case there's something there that they need fixed or something they caught in the audio. If you're filing the NPR, they're going to mix it down for you, which is amazing. So you definitely need it for them because they will reach out to you if your voicing sounds a little off or the soundbite didn't come through clearly, whatever it might be. And then ask where it's airing because you just did a lot of work. So find out when you're going to be on the radio, and that's really cool. Okay, that's enough of that. I wanted to ask to get us going. Let's see. William asked this question earlier on, and Frank and Grant, do you tell people that they're going to be put into sound bites when you're doing the interviews?
It just depends. I mean, oftentimes that's part of that little thing. Like, hey, you can trip up. Don't worry about restating that. Just stop and say it again. You're only going to be in there like a couple of times and for a few seconds each time. Sometimes it do, sometimes it don't.
Yeah, not to try to minimize their part in the story, but just to kind of, tell them how this is going to shake out.
We also have a question from Melissa. She would like to know, do you write your audio script, then the print version or the digital version? She says, I always feel my brain splitting into half. One half is thinking audio, one is thinking the print voice. What's your strategy for which you write first?
I usually I write audio first because usually my audio deadline is first. And so that's just sort of where everything hits. I try to think ahead on the stuff that trips me up with writing my web story, like the headline. I'll start thinking about the headline, or I'll start thinking about how I'm going to start this web story, because the structures can end up being pretty different sometimes.
I'm a radio reporter, so I just write radio scripts and then turn them into online scripts. I wish that wasn't the case, but that's how.
Yeah, I would say it depends what your deadline is. Sometimes the radio has already been slotted for something, so you need to get that in first, and then you can do the digital version. If you've got the luxury of time, it's nice to sometimes write the digital version first, because that's going to be the bigger, longer version with more quotes and information, and then you can kind of take the main sections and use that to write your script. But I also tend to do the radio script first, and then I have an extra sheet that I call my orphans, and I take all the sound bites and stuff that gets cut out of my script, and I know I'm going to use that in my digital version, so I'll make sure I include it in that. Everyone, please enter some questions. We got about 6 minutes left. Maria, do you have any questions?
I really don't. I'm going to go back to voicing very quickly. One on feel free, if you're nervous about a piece, to have your editor sit in while you voice. I've done that several times on bigger like podcasts or investigative stories where the voicing was just going to be a little bit more critical than just for a regular piece. And if you can kind of get over the nerves of having somebody sit in a studio with you, it can be really helpful, because having a second set of ears to say, oh, you know what, your tone was just not quite right for that piece. The other thing that I would say for your typical 3.5 minute pieces is, for me as a reporter, I voiced it 3 times, and I usually found my second voicing was the better. The second track just was good, but it's wonderful to have that 3 full tracks. So if you find that there was just one word that you didn't realize you bobbled, or just something that didn't quite work, you can steal it from, the other track you did.
I do that.
I mean, I'm kind of a weirdo about voicing, and I take it really, really seriously, because to me, it's like that's the interface. You do all this work, and if the voicing sucks, then you're kind of out of luck. And I will, like stand up, sit down, do different things depending on what's happening in the story. If you're suddenly like at a loud place, I'll stand up and say, so this thing, and I'll talk louder. Let's turn it down and talk louder, because you're at a loud place. And you know, and for me, it's just all like I listen back, not just to hear if I stumble over words, I always stumble over words, but you know, to say it sounds normal or not. If it sounds fakey, you know, like sometimes I can sound like Casey Kasem, you know, I mean, but I mean, there are a million ways to like have your voicing suck, and really, I think it's hard to make it sound, you know, like you know, you're clearly articulating everything, but also just tossing it out there or saying it to a friend. So, I mean, I think voicing can be like a throwaway thing at the end of the story. I never think of it like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And pacing is your friend. You don't have to read everything at the same pace. You know, some stuff people already, the information they kind of already know, like, and you're just reminding them. You don't have to be really slow, you know, and other stuff is more complicated or more serious, and you can slow down a bit. So keep that in mind too.
Always rush the boilerplate.
I have one more question for you, both of you. Oftentimes you get assigned a feature that you have to turn really quickly, and it may be a topic that you're not as familiar with. We've been talking a lot about like pitching and doing stories that you've researched and you've vetted, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you get assigned a story and you have to, you know, Frank, you have to drive to New Orleans, or Grant, you've got to go because some political thing is breaking. How do you bone up and prep for a feature like on your way once you've been assigned to make sure that you're going to like quickly get everything that you need to get for that feature? Let's start with Frank on this one.
Before I leave, I mean, even if I'm in a really big rush, I get some phone numbers that I can call while I'm in the car, and you know, oftentimes my wife will help me because she's a reporter, and so she will like start, you know, looking at stuff, and she'll be calling and telling me stuff, but I'll be reaching out to people while I'm in the car, trying to just get a sense of what's happening there, and so that, yeah, just so I'm not wasting a bunch of time once I get there. But you know, and I'll also just take, you know, a little too much time to read in before I leave, but mainly it's just working the phone in the car.
Yeah, Grant, you
I'll
got 2
trust
minutes.
Frank on that one.
That I would add, ideally, if this is a situation, hopefully your editor can help you prep a little bit too, and get you some resources and material that you can read as soon as you get to the hotel or wherever you're going to go do the story. That's probably truly helpful. We are at time right now, so I want to thank everyone for joining us, particularly Grant and Frank. Thank you for your time today. I think this was pretty helpful. Maria, thank you as well. I think this seems like it was a pretty useful topic. So in the future, Maria and I have already talked about maybe doing some more advanced audio reporting things that maybe aren't 2 days, but just a one-off session on script writing or voicing or interview tactics. That could be helpful. So let us know at the Midwest Newsroom if there are any ideas that you have that you would like us to spend some time covering for you all. Maria, do you have anything else? Yeah.
No, thank you so much for Chris did all the slides and really took the lead on this. So thank you, Chris. And yeah, Grant and Frank, your insights are really great. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, these will be up on YouTube this week and we'll share them out. Thanks everyone for joining, and take care. Bye.
See you later.